She just wanted to help. A simple gesture, the kind no one notices. Buying a burger for a confused, lonely elderly man. But what seemed like an act of kindness ended up costing her job, her peace of mind, and opened doors to secrets that had been buried for decades. What would you do if in reaching out to a stranger you discovered he carried a forgotten piece of your own history? Gradually, what appeared to be just an injustice transforms into a whirlwind of revelations, family lies, hidden betrayals, torn documents, and a will that could change everything. But when the truth finally surfaces, is it too late? Prepare to dive into a story that will make you question who you are, where you came from, and how far you'd go for a piece of love the world denied you. Because in the end, what was inside that burger box wasn't food, it was a forgotten legacy. Subscribe now and come feel every second of this story. Which city are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The old man's hands trembled as he tried to slot two 50-cent coins into the self-service machine at the McDonald's in Lower Hutt. One coin slipped from his weathered fingers and clattered onto the polished floor, rolling under a nearby table. Behind the counter, Maya Taucamo watched the scene unfold with growing unease, her stained apron a testament to another long shift that seemed to stretch endlessly. The digital clock above the drive-thru window read 3:42 p.m. Still hours before she could escape this fluorescent-lit purgatory. Her colleagues exchanged knowing smirks, whispering amongst themselves like schoolchildren sharing secrets. "Another homeless bloke begging for a free feed," snickered Jake, the spotty teenager who worked the fryer. "Bet he hasn't had a proper wash in weeks." The casual cruelty in their laughter made Maya's stomach turn. She'd grown up hearing those same dismissive tones, the way people spoke about others when they thought no one who mattered was listening. But something about this particular scene pierced through Maya's usual professional detachment. The elderly man wasn't just confused about the machine. He seemed genuinely lost, as if he'd wandered into this bright, noisy restaurant from another world entirely. His gray hair hung limp around his shoulders, and his clothes, whilst clean, bore the telltale signs of someone who'd been wearing them for far too long. When the self-service screen froze for the third time, displaying an error message in stark red letters, the old man's shoulders sagged with defeat. "No worries," he mumbled to no one in particular, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who'd spent decades in New Zealand but might have been born elsewhere. "I only wanted a coffee anyway, just something warm." The resignation in his voice was what broke Maya's resolve. She'd heard that same tone countless times growing up in the Kanga Tapu children's home, the sound of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from the world. Without thinking, Maya stepped out from behind the counter, her sensible black shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. She approached the man with the careful deliberation of someone who understood what it meant to be invisible, to be dismissed before you'd even spoken. "Excuse me," she said softly, careful not to startle him. "The machine's been playing up all morning. How about I sort this for you?" The old man looked up at her with eyes that held depths of confusion and gratitude. They were pale blue like winter sky over Wellington Harbor, and for a moment Maya felt an odd stirring of recognition, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. "That's very kind of you, love," he said, and there was something in his accent, a hint of European inflection beneath the familiar Kiwi drawl, that made her pause. Maya pulled her staff card from her apron pocket and swiped it through the register. "Right then, what can I get you? Coffee and..." She glanced at the menu board, calculating quickly in her head. Her own bank account was running dangerously low. Rent was due next week, and her adoptive mother Anika's medical bills seemed to multiply like weeds. But sometimes, she thought, you had to choose between being practical and being human. "Just coffee would be lovely," the man insisted, but Maya was already punching in the order. A flat white and a Big Mac meal. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. As she processed her own card payment, a small act of rebellion against the corporate machine that employed her, she felt a familiar mix of anxiety and righteousness. She'd probably catch hell for this, but some things mattered more than keeping her head down. "There you go," she said, handing him the receipt. "Won't be long." The gratitude in his eyes was almost overwhelming. When was the last time someone had looked at her like that? Like she'd done something that actually mattered? As the old man shuffled to find a seat, choosing a corner table where he could watch the car park through rain-streaked windows, Maya returned to her station. She tried to focus on restocking napkin dispensers and wiping down surfaces, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. The man ate slowly, methodically, as if each bite was precious. He'd unwrapped the burger with the careful reverence some people reserved for Christmas presents. That's when she noticed Nolan Rook watching her from the office doorway. Her manager's expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his gaze that made her stomach drop. Nolan was one of those people who seemed to take personal offense at any deviation from procedure, no matter how small or well-intentioned. He'd been particularly harsh with her lately, though she couldn't work out why. It wasn't like she was a troublemaker. Quite the opposite, really. "Maya," Nolan called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that every service worker learned to dread. "Could I have a word?" The way he said it wasn't really a question. Around the restaurant, conversations continued, the usual afternoon crowd of school kids and shift workers oblivious to the small drama unfolding behind the counter. The walk to the office felt longer than it should have. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed Nolan through the maze of stainless steel equipment and industrial freezers. The back office was cramped and windowless, dominated by a desk covered in invoices and roster sheets. The walls were plastered with corporate motivational posters. Teamwork makes the dream work, that somehow managed to make the space feel even more oppressive. Nolan didn't invite her to sit. He stood behind his desk like a judge about to deliver a verdict, his hands clasped behind his back. "You broke protocol," he said without preamble. "Staff are not permitted to purchase meals for customers. It's clearly outlined in the Employee Handbook, Section 4.2. His voice was flat, clinical, as if he were reading from a script. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was confused, and the machine wasn't working. It was just a violation of company policy. Nolan interrupted. "This isn't a charity, Maya. We're running a business here." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, already prepared. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You're firing me? For buying an old man lunch?" The injustice of it was breathtaking. She thought about all the time she'd seen staff take home leftover food, all the small rule bending that happened daily in any workplace. But this, an act of basic human decency, this was what crossed the line. "Company policy is company policy," Nolan said, though something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? Regret? Whatever it was, it vanished quickly. "Clear out your locker and return your uniform. Security will escort you out." The next few minutes passed in a blur of humiliation. Other staff members averted their eyes as Maya gathered her few personal belongings from the break room locker. A small potted plant Aneki had given her for luck, a spare hoodie, a packet of paracetamol. The security guard, a bored-looking man who couldn't have been much older than herself, walked her to the exit with all the ceremony of a prisoner being led to execution. Outside, the Wellington weather was doing its usual impression of indecision. Drizzle misted the air, not quite rain, but enough to soak through clothing given time. Maya stood on the footpath, clutching her small box of possessions, watching the world continue as if nothing had changed. Through the restaurant windows, she could see the old man still sitting at his corner table, carefully folding the burger wrapper into neat squares. A young couple walked past, laughing about something on one of their phones. They stepped around the old man as he emerged from the restaurant, treating him like an obstacle rather than a person. Maya felt a fresh surge of anger. Not just at Nolan, not just at the unfairness of losing her job, but at the casual indifference that seemed to be everywhere. When had kindness become so revolutionary? The old man noticed her standing there and approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, love, but wasn't you just working in there?" His confusion was evident. The same lost quality that had first caught her attention. "Not anymore," Maya said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But that's all right. I hope you enjoyed your meal." He studied her face with those pale blue eyes, and for a moment something seemed to clear in his expression. "You got in trouble because of me, didn't you?" "Oh dear, I'm so sorry." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 note. "Please take this. It's not right that you should suffer for being kind." Maya gently pushed his hand away. "Keep your money. Some things are more important than keeping a job." And as she said it, she realized she meant it. Yes, she was unemployed. Yes, she had bills to pay and a sick mother depending on her. But she'd still choose to be the kind of person who bought coffee for confused old men, even if it cost her everything. As she walked away down the high street, Maya didn't notice the old man standing in the drizzle, watching her go with an expression of profound sadness. She didn't see him reach into his other pocket and pull out a photograph, old and faded, which he stared at for a long moment before carefully putting it away. And she certainly couldn't have known that in 3 days' time, She would receive a phone call that would turn her entire understanding of herself upside down. But sometimes the most important moments of our lives happen when we're not paying attention. Sometimes kindness plants seeds in soil we didn't even know existed. And sometimes the person you save with a simple gesture turns out to be the key to unlocking secrets that have been buried for decades. The rain began to fall harder as Maya walked home, each drop carrying with it the weight of change. "Hello, is this Maya Taucamo? This is Piers Hiraka, assistant to Roberto Vidal. Mr. Vidal would like to see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. at Makutu Cafe in Kelburn." Maya gripped her mobile phone with trembling hands, standing in the cramped lounge she shared with her adoptive mother in their Nene rental. The leather sofa beneath her was cracked and worn, a relic from better times that Anneke had refused to replace. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Patterson next door watching Coronation Street at volume that suggested hearing aids weren't quite doing their job. The name Roberto Vidal meant absolutely nothing to her. She'd spent the 3 days since her dismissal scouring Trade Me for job listings and trying to work up the courage to ring winds about emergency assistance. The last thing she'd expected was a mysterious phone call from someone claiming to be connected to, well, to what exactly? "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Roberto Vidal? I don't think I know anyone by that name," she managed, though her voice sounded strange and hollow in her own ears. "He owns the McDonald's franchise where you were recently employed," Piers explained, his voice carrying the polished professionalism of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. "He saw something concerning and wants to discuss it with you personally." There was a pause, the kind of loaded silence that suggested there was much more to this story than was being revealed over the phone. "It's quite important, Miss Taucamo. Would 9 a.m. tomorrow suit you?" Maya's mind raced. The owner of the franchise? She'd never even heard his name mentioned in all her months working there. McDonald's felt like such a faceless corporation. She'd assumed some distant Auckland or Sydney office made all the real decisions. The idea that there was an actual person, a New Zealander presumably, who owned her little branch in Lower Hutt, was oddly humanizing and terrifying at the same time. Yes, I suppose so," she heard herself saying. "Makutu Cafe in Kelburn, 9 o'clock. She repeated the details like a mantra, already wondering how she'd afford the bus fare to get there. Kelburn wasn't exactly her usual stomping ground. It was university territory, the domain of students whose parents paid their rent and bought them coffee that cost more than her hourly wage had been. "Excellent. Mr. Vidal will be waiting for you. And Miss Taucamo?" Piers's voice carried a note of something. Sympathy? Warning? "What happened to you wasn't right. Mr. Vidal wants to make things right." The call ended before Maya could ask what that might mean. She spent the night staring at the water-stained ceiling of her bedroom, listening to Anneke's labored breathing from the next room. Her adoptive mother's health had been declining rapidly since the chemotherapy ended. The doctors said they'd done all they could, that it was just a matter of time now. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Maya. Just when Anneke needed her most, she'd lost her job doing the one thing that had made her unemployable for weeks to come, showing inappropriate kindness to a customer. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of pale blue eyes and trembling hands counting coins. She woke before dawn feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed, her mouth dry with anxiety. The face that stared back at her from the bathroom mirror looked older than her 28 years. Stress etched in the lines around her dark eyes and the set of her jaw. Wellington weather was doing its typical early morning performance, wind howling through the Nanai streets like a banshee, sending rubbish bins tumbling and making the windows of their small rental shake in their frames. Maya dressed carefully in her one good outfit, dark jeans that weren't quite smart enough for job interviews but weren't covered in grease stains, and a cream wool jumper that Anneke had knitted for her last Christmas. Her shoes were her everyday sneakers, clean but obviously cheap. She'd tried to tame her naturally curly hair into something approaching professional, but the Wellington wind would have other ideas once she stepped outside. The bus journey to Kelburn felt like crossing into another world. As they climbed the winding roads up from the Hutt Valley, the houses grew larger and the gardens more manicured. By the time they reached the university precinct, Maya felt like an imposter in her own city. Students streamed past with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity bills, their expensive coffee cups and designer backpacks marking them as members of a tribe she'd never belonged to. Makutu Cafe sat on a corner that commanded sweeping views across Wellington Harbor. Through the large windows, Maya could see white-capped waves dancing in the morning light. Cook Strait stretching towards the South Island like a promise of escape. The cafe itself was exactly what she'd expected. Exposed brick walls, industrial light fittings, and the kind of carefully curated shabby chic aesthetic that probably cost more to achieve than most people earned in a month. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she looked. Through the glass, she could see the morning crowd. Laptop-wielding post-grad students, well-dressed professionals conducting business meetings over flat whites, the kind of people for whom a $12 breakfast was just another Tuesday morning expense. This wasn't her world, and everyone would know it the moment she walked in. But before she could lose her nerve completely, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair that caught the morning light and the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His clothes were expensive but understated, the sort of careful wealth that didn't need to announce itself. When he saw her, his expression shifted to something like recognition. "You must be Maya," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Roberto Vidal. Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his smile seemed genuine, though there was something in his eyes, a sadness perhaps, or the weight of difficult knowledge. "Please, shall we find somewhere to talk? I've taken the liberty of securing a private table." Inside, the cafe buzzed with the comfortable chatter of people who belonged there. Roberto led her to a corner table that had been set slightly apart from the others, positioned to offer both privacy and a view of the harbor. A server appeared almost immediately. Clearly, Roberto was a regular customer, and he ordered for them both without consulting a menu. "2 flat whites and the breakfast selection, thanks, Emma." The casual familiarity of it all made Maya feel even more like an outsider looking in. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here," Roberto said once they were alone. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table, and Maya noticed he wore a vintage watch that looked like it might have been his father's. "I saw the security footage from the restaurant, what you did for that elderly gentleman, and what happened to you as a result." His voice carried a mixture of admiration and anger that surprised her. "I just bought him lunch," Maya said quietly. It wasn't some grand gesture. He looked confused and hungry, and the machine wasn't working properly. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, uncertain why she was defending herself to this man who seemed to be on her side. "It was more than that," Roberto said firmly. "It was decency, humanity, the kind of basic kindness that seems to be increasingly rare in the world." He paused as Emma delivered their coffee, the ceramic cups elegant and warm between Maya's nervous hands. "But there's something else, something about that particular gentleman that I need to discuss with you." The coffee was excellent, rich and smooth in a way that made her usual instant coffee seem like a cruel joke, but Maya barely tasted it. There was something in Roberto's manner that suggested this conversation was about to take a turn she wasn't prepared for. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Roberto reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a photograph. It was clearly old, the colors slightly faded, showing a man who might once have been handsome but now bore the unmistakable ravages of time and confusion. Even in the photo, his pale blue eyes held that same lost quality that had first caught Maya's attention in the restaurant. "The man you helped?" Roberto said quietly. "His name is Leif Vidal. He's my father." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the confused old man she'd encountered with the idea that he was this polished businessman's father. "Your father?" But he seemed so. She trailed off, uncertain how to finish the sentence without giving offense. "Lost? Confused? Alone?" Roberto's voice was heavy with pain. "Yes, all of those things. He has Alzheimer's, though we only received the formal diagnosis 2 years ago. The signs had been there much longer." He took a sip of his coffee, and Maya noticed his hands weren't entirely steady. "He disappeared from his care facility 15 years ago, after a family argument that I deeply regret. We assumed he had died." 15 years. Maya tried to imagine this man, this father, wandering confused and alone for 15 years, while his family mourned him as dead. The tragedy of it was overwhelming. "How did you find him?" she asked. "We didn't, not really." Roberto's smile was bitter. "Someone filmed your dismissal on their phone and posted it on social media. Heartless manager fires worker for showing kindness. That sort of thing. The video went viral locally, and someone who knew my father from years ago recognized him." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. This is how I learned my father was still alive. The video was grainy but clear enough. There was the old man, Leaf, carefully unwrapping his burger while in the background Maya could be seen being escorted from the building by security. The comments below were a mixture of outrage at her treatment and sympathy for the elderly customer. Someone had written, "That's Leif Vidal. He used to own the hardware store in Petone. Haven't seen him in years. Where has he been?" "I drove to Lower Hutt immediately," Roberto continued. "But by the time I got there, he was gone. The staff said he'd finished his meal and simply walked out. We've been searching for him ever since." His voice broke slightly. 3 days, and no sign of him. An elderly man with dementia, alone on the streets. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wellington wind rattling the cafe windows. She thought about Leif's confusion, his gratitude for such a simple gesture, the way he'd tried to give her money afterwards. Where was he sleeping? Was he eating? Did he even remember the kindness of strangers? Or had it already faded into the fog of his failing memory? "I'm so sorry," she said inadequately. "I had no idea. If I'd known, but what could she have done differently?" She'd lost her job for showing him basic human kindness. Was she supposed to have kidnapped him? Called the police? The helplessness of it all was crushing. "There's something else," Roberto said quietly. He reached into his jacket again and this time withdrew another photograph. This one even older and more faded. "I need you to look at this and tell me if you recognize anyone." Maya took the photo with trembling hands. It showed 2 women, both young, standing outside what looked like a church. One was clearly Maori, with the kind of traditional beauty that spoke of generations of strength and resilience. The other was pale and blonde, visibly pregnant with an expression of profound sadness despite her smile. Behind them, partly visible in the background, was a faded sign, Katikati Church, 1996. The Maori woman was unmistakably familiar, even 28 years younger, even without the gray hair and lined face that Maya had known all her life. There was no mistaking those features. "That's Anneke," she whispered. "That's my mother." But even as she said it, confusion clouded her thoughts. Anneke had never mentioned knowing anyone in Katikati. In fact, she'd always been vague about their past, claiming that some memories were too painful to share. "And the other woman?" Roberto prompted gently. Maya studied the blonde woman more carefully. There was something about her features, something that nagged at the edge of recognition, but she couldn't place it. "I don't know. Should I?" But even as she asked the question, an uncomfortable suspicion was beginning to form in the back of her mind. Roberto's expression was grave as he leaned forward. "The blonde woman is Rhiannon. She was my half-sister. And if what I suspect is true..." He paused as if the words were physically difficult to speak. "Maya, I think you might be my niece." Maya clutched the faded photograph as if it were made of glass, her hands trembling so violently that the image of her adoptive mother and the mysterious pregnant woman seemed to shimmer before her eyes. The Wellington wind had picked up outside Makutu Cafe, rattling the windows with the kind of fury that suggested a proper southerly was brewing. But inside her chest, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that threatened to tear apart everything she thought she knew about herself. The bus journey back to Nainai passed in a blur of suburban streets and racing thoughts. Roberto's words echoed in her mind like a broken record. "I think you might be my niece." The possibility seemed both impossible and inevitable, like a puzzle piece that had been sitting in plain sight for 28 years. Waiting for someone to notice it belonged to a completely different picture. How could Anneke have kept such a secret? How could she have raised Maya for nearly 3 decades without ever mentioning that her biological family might still be out there, still searching, still grieving? By the time she reached their small rental in Nainai, the clouds had opened and Wellington was doing its impression of a city underwater. Rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof, with the persistence of someone demanding answers. Maya fumbled with her keys at the front door, her fingers numb with cold and shock, droplets of water running down her neck and soaking through her wool jumper. The house felt different somehow, as if the conversation with Roberto had shifted the very foundations of what she'd thought was home. The familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet, the faint smell of lavender fabric softener that Annika had always used, the collection of ceramic birds on the windowsill that had been there since Maya was a child. Everything looked the same, but felt foreign, like stage props in a play she'd been unknowingly performing her entire life. "Anneke," she called out, hanging her damp jacket on the hook by the door. "I'm home." But the silence that greeted her was wrong somehow. too thick and heavy. Usually there would be the sound of the television, or Anneke moving about in the kitchen, or at the very least, the familiar wheeze of her breathing from whichever room she'd chosen to rest in that day. The lounge was empty, though Anneke's favorite blanket, a patchwork creation she'd made during Maya's teenage years, was folded neatly on the sofa. The kitchen showed no signs of recent activity, the breakfast dishes still sitting exactly where Maya had left them that morning. A cold dread began to settle in her stomach as she walked down the narrow hallway towards the bedrooms. She found Carol Jenkins, the community nurse who'd been helping with Anneke's care, sitting quietly in the bedroom chair. Carol's usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by the kind of professional compassion that healthcare workers wore like armor when delivering the worst possible news. In her hands was a manila folder, and her eyes held the weight of knowledge that would change everything. "Maya, love," Carol said softly, rising from the chair. "I'm so sorry." She passed peacefully during the night. Her heart just stopped. The words seemed to float in the air between them, taking a moment to land with their full impact. "She left this for you. Said it was important that you read it when the time was right." The folder felt heavier than it should have as Carol placed it in Maya's numb hands. On the cover, written in Anneke's familiar handwriting, shakier than usual but unmistakably hers, were the words, "If you ever discover the truth, please forgive me." The irony of the timing wasn't lost on Maya. Just hours after learning she might have living relatives, she'd lost the only family she'd ever known. Carol stayed long enough to explain the procedures, the phone calls that needed to be made, the arrangements that would need to be handled, but her voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the cotton wool that grief had wrapped around Maya's brain. She nodded at appropriate intervals, signed forms she didn't really read, and accepted the contact cards for funeral directors and grief counselors with hands that felt disconnected from her body. It wasn't until Carol had gone, until the house had settled back into its new permanent silence, that Maya found the courage to open the folder. Inside was a single letter, written on the same notepaper Anneke had always used for important correspondence. Cream-colored with a border of native ferns, the handwriting was more labored than usual, suggesting it had been written during one of her difficult days, when the medication made her hands shake and her thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. "My dearest Maya," the letter began, and even reading those familiar words in her adoptive mother's voice made fresh tears spill down Maya's cheeks. "If you are reading this, then the truth has finally found its way to the surface, as truth always does. I have carried this secret for 28 years, and it has grown heavier with each passing day. I told myself I was protecting you, but perhaps I was only protecting myself from losing you." What followed was a story that seemed to belong to someone else's life, a narrative so different from everything Maya had been told about her origins that she had to read it twice before the words began to make sense. According to Anneke's confession, she had been working as a cleaner at a church in Katikati when a young woman had arrived one winter morning, heavily pregnant and clearly desperate. Her name was Rhiannon, the letter continued, and she was the most frightened person I had ever encountered. She told me she was running from her family, that they would take the baby if they found her. She said she was the daughter of a powerful man who had forbidden her relationship with your father, a young Maori man from the East Coast. When she discovered she was pregnant, she knew she had to choose between her family's money and her child's safety. Maya's hands were shaking so badly now that the letter rustled like autumn leaves. The pieces were beginning to fit together in ways that made her stomach churn. Rhiannon, the blonde woman in the photograph Roberto had shown her, the daughter of a powerful man, Roberto's half-sister. "She begged me to take you," Anneke's letter continued, "to raise you as my own. She said it was the only way to keep you safe from the legal battles and custody fights that would destroy your chance at a normal childhood." I agreed because I could see the love in her eyes, the desperate kind of love that would sacrifice everything for a child's well-being, but also because I had always wanted a daughter, and you were the most beautiful baby I had ever seen. The next paragraph was smudged, as if tears had fallen on the ink while Anneke was writing. I tried to convince her to stay, to let me help her fight for her rights, but she was so young, Maya, barely 20 years old and terrified of what her family might do. She left the day after you were born, and I never saw her again. I heard rumors years later that she had died in a car accident in Australia, but I was never certain. Maya set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation. Her entire life story, carefully constructed and lovingly maintained by Anneke, was crumbling around her like a house of cards in Wellington wind. She wasn't just an orphan who'd been lucky enough to be adopted by a kind woman. She was the granddaughter of a man she'd bought a hamburger for 3 days ago. She was the niece of the businessman who'd offered her coffee and sympathy that morning. She was the daughter of a woman who'd died young and afraid, far from home. But there was more to Anneke's confession, details that made the betrayal feel even more complex and painful. As you grew older, the letter continued, I began to fear what would happen if your biological family ever found you. The Vidals were wealthy and influential, and I was just a cleaner who'd bent the rules to help a desperate girl. I convinced myself that you were better off not knowing, that ignorance would protect you from heartbreak. The most devastating revelation came in the final paragraphs. Last year, when the man started appearing around the neighborhood, confused and asking about a daughter named Rhiannon, I knew who he was immediately. Leif Vidal had aged terribly, but those eyes were unmistakable. I should have told you then, should have helped reunite you with your grandfather. Instead, I called the medical authorities and had him taken to a care facility. I told myself it was for his own safety, but truly I was terrified of losing you. Maya felt sick. The old man, her grandfather, had been looking for her family, looking for connections to his lost daughter. And Anneke, the woman who'd raised her with such love and dedication, had actively prevented that reunion. The complexity of the betrayal was staggering. How do you hate someone for protecting you? How do you forgive someone for lying to you about everything? The letter ended with words that would haunt Maya for years to come. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I robbed you of your heritage, your biological family, and potentially years of love and connection. But please know that every day with you has been the greatest joy of my life. You made me a mother when I thought that gift was beyond my reach. I hope someday you can understand why I made the choices I did, even if you cannot forgive them. Outside, the Wellington rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, each drop like a tear the sky was shedding for secrets finally revealed. Maya sat in the growing darkness of evening, clutching her adoptive mother's final confession, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. In the space of 12 hours, she had gained a family and lost a mother, discovered a grandfather, and learned of his disappearance, found answers to questions she'd never known to ask, and realized that some truths were more painful than any lie. The house felt enormous and empty around her, filled with memories of a woman who had loved her enough to lie to her for 28 years. On the kitchen table, next to a wilted plant that Anneke had been nursing back to health, sat an unopened envelope from the power company. Final notice. Even in death, Anneke was still trying to protect her from harsh realities. As darkness settled over Nanai like a blanket, Maya made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would call Roberto Vidal. She would tell him about Anneke's letter, about the confession that painted his missing father not as a random homeless man, but as her grandfather, a man who had been searching for his lost family until Alzheimer's stole even that desperate hope away. But tonight she would grieve. For Anneke, who had loved imperfectly, but completely. For Rhiannon, the mother she would never know. For Leif, wandering confused and alone somewhere in Wellington's streets. And for herself, the granddaughter, niece and daughter who had lived her entire life as a stranger to her own story. The photograph Roberto had shown her was still in her pocket, creased now from her nervous handling. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, she could just make out Anneke's young face, full of hope and kindness, standing beside a pregnant girl who would become just another family secret. How many other secrets were buried in the foundations of her life? How many other truths were waiting to surface, waiting to reshape everything she thought she knew about love, family, and belonging? The rain finally began to ease as midnight approached, leaving behind the kind of profound quiet that only comes after storms. In that silence, Maya could almost hear the echo of all the conversations that had never happened, all the family dinners that had been prevented, all the love that had been lost to fear and good intentions gone wrong. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new complications, new pain. But tonight she would sit with her grief and her rage and her terrible, complicated love for the woman who had saved her by stealing her away from everything she was meant to be. The morning after burying her secrets along with her adoptive mother, Maya found herself standing outside the McDonald's in Lower Hutt, with a purpose that felt both urgent and terrifying. She needed to collect her final payslip and personal tax documents. bureaucratic necessities that seemed absurdly mundane in the wake of earth-shattering revelations about her identity. But more than that, she needed to confront the space where everything had begun, where a simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of discoveries that had turned her life inside out. The restaurant looked exactly the same as it had 5 days earlier, when she'd walked out in disgrace with her box of personal belongings. The same promotional posters in the windows advertising meal deals, the same collection of teenagers congregating outside with their energy drinks and attitude, the same relentless hum of commerce and routine that made the world feel crushingly normal, despite the chaos in her personal universe. She pushed through the glass doors with the confidence of someone who belonged there, hoping that familiarity would carry her through what she knew would be an uncomfortable encounter. The morning rush was in full swing. Office workers grabbing coffee before catching the train to Wellington, parents bribing children with hash browns, shift workers from the nearby hospital grabbing something quick between long days of saving lives. The smell of frying oil and cleaning products hit her like a physical memory, transporting her back to countless mornings when her biggest worry had been whether the ice cream machine would break down during her shift. Behind the counter, she recognized most of the faces. Jake still working the fryer with his characteristic lack of enthusiasm, Sarah managing the drive-thru with her usual cheerful efficiency, Maria restocking napkin dispensers with the methodical precision of someone who'd been doing the job for longer than she cared to remember. They glanced up when she entered, their expressions ranging from awkward sympathy to barely concealed curiosity. Word traveled fast in small workplaces, and she was certain that her dismissal had been dissected and analyzed by every staff member within hours of it happening. "Maya?" Sarah called out, abandoning her post at the drive-thru window. "What are you doing here? I thought—" She gestured vaguely towards the office area, clearly uncertain how to finish the sentence diplomatically. "Just collecting some paperwork," Maya replied, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Final pay slip, that sort of thing." It was a reasonable excuse, the kind of practical necessity that would explain her presence without requiring detailed explanations about family secrets and missing grandfathers. "Is Nolan in?" The question seemed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable, as if her mere mention of their manager's name was enough to summon trouble. Jake looked up from the fryer with an expression that suggested he was witnessing the preliminary stages of a car crash. "Yeah, he's in the office," Sarah said hesitantly. "But Maya, maybe you should you could probably call about the paperwork instead of—" But Maya was already walking towards the back of the restaurant, driven by a determination that surprised even her. The conversation with Roberto Vidal had planted questions in her mind that demanded answers, and her adoptive mother's confession had only multiplied those questions exponentially. If she was truly Leif Vidal's granddaughter, if Nolan Rook had been part of the family that had lost track of the confused old man, then there were connections here that needed to be explored, confrontations that needed to happen. The office door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Nolan hunched over his desk, apparently absorbed in paperwork. But as she got closer, she realized what he was actually doing, and the sight made her blood run cold. In his hands was an envelope with her name written on it in handwriting she didn't recognize, official-looking, formal, the kind of correspondence that suggested legal or business matters, and he was systematically tearing it into small pieces, feeding the fragments into a small desktop shredder with the methodical precision of someone destroying evidence. "Nolan." The word exploded from her lips before she could stop herself, loud enough to make several customers in the restaurant turn and stare. "What the hell are you doing with that?" He froze like a deer caught in headlights, the remaining pieces of the envelope still clutched in his hands. For a moment his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, fear, and finally a kind of desperate calculation, as he tried to work out how much she had seen and how much trouble he was in. "Maya," he said, and his voice had a quality she'd never heard before. Shaky, uncertain, nothing like the cold authority he'd wielded during her dismissal. It's not what it looks like." But even as he said it, he was still holding the torn pieces of the envelope. The evidence of whatever he'd been trying to hide scattered across his desk like confetti at a celebration she hadn't been invited to. "It's got my name on it," she said, stepping fully into the office and closing the door behind her. The space felt even smaller and more oppressive than it had during her firing, the motivational posters on the walls seeming to mock the tension that was building between them like pressure in a kettle about to boil. "That's my mail you're destroying. That's illegal." Nolan's composure cracked completely then, the careful mask of managerial authority sliding away to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising towards hysteria. "This isn't just about you. This is about my family. This is about things that happened before you were even born." He gestured wildly at the shredded remains of the envelope, as if the pieces themselves were somehow dangerous. "You have no idea what kind of damage this could do." Maya moved closer to the desk, trying to piece together the fragments of whatever document he'd been destroying. Most of it was too small to read, but she could make out part of a letterhead, what looked like a legal firm's logo, and her own name printed in formal typeface. "What was it?" she demanded. "What was in that envelope that was so important you had to destroy it?" For a moment, Nolan looked like he might refuse to answer, might retreat behind the kind of corporate speak that managers use to avoid taking responsibility for anything. But something in her expression, or perhaps the weight of his own guilt, seemed to break down his resistance entirely. "It was from Roberto Vidal's lawyers," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A formal request for a meeting about possible family connections, about biological relationships between you and the Vidal family." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the bitter sound of someone whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. "I've been intercepting your mail for weeks, ever since the old man started showing up in the neighborhood." The admission hit Maya like a physical blow. Not only had Nolan fired her for showing kindness to her own grandfather, he had been actively sabotaging any chance of reunion or recognition. "You knew," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You knew who he was. You knew who I was. And you fired me anyway." "I fired you because of who you are," Nolan shot back, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced his initial panic. "Do you have any idea what that man did to our family? What he put my mother through?" He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee mug and sending liquid spreading across the scattered paper fragments. "He destroyed everything we had. Everything." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Nolan's unusual hostility towards her, his immediate and seemingly disproportionate response to her act of kindness, his determination to prevent any possibility of reconciliation or recognition. "You're his son," Maya said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. "Leif is your father too." "Was my father," Nolan corrected viciously. "He stopped being my father the day he chose his precious Rhiannon over the family that actually needed him." The name of Maya's biological mother came out like a curse, laden with decades of resentment and pain. "Do you know what it's like to watch your mother cry herself to sleep every night because her husband is obsessed with a daughter who doesn't even want to be found? Do you know what it's like to be the son who was never good enough, never interesting enough, never loved enough to keep him home?" Maya felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, the same sensation she'd experienced in the cafe with Roberto, as if the entire foundation of reality was proving to be less solid than she'd believed. Nolan wasn't just her manager who had unfairly dismissed her. He was her uncle, the man who had humiliated her, who had destroyed her livelihood, who had been systematically preventing her from discovering her own family history, was her own blood relative. "I grew up knowing I had a half-sister somewhere out there," Nolan continued, his voice gaining momentum as years of suppressed resentment came pouring out. "Rhiannon, the golden child, the one who got away, the one Dad talked about when he thought no one was listening. And then she had a baby. And suddenly that baby became more important than the family he actually had, more important than Mom, more important than me, more important than anyone who was actually in his life. The cruelty of it was breathtaking." Maya thought about Leif wandering confused and alone, probably looking for some connection to the daughter he'd lost and the granddaughter he'd never known. And here was his son, his own flesh and blood, actively working to ensure that no such connection could ever be made. "So when you recognized him that day," Maya said slowly, working through the implications, "when you saw me helping him, you decided to punish both of us." "I decided to protect what was left of my family's dignity," Nolan snapped. "The man is sick, Maya. He doesn't remember who he is half the time. The last thing he needs is some stranger showing up claiming to be his long-lost granddaughter, expecting inheritance money or family recognition or whatever it is you're really after." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong, so completely opposite to everything she actually wanted. "I don't want money," Maya said quietly. "I just wanted to help an old man who looked confused and hungry. I had no idea who he was. I had no idea who I was." Something in her tone seemed to penetrate Nolan's anger, and for the first time since she'd caught him destroying her mail, he looked uncertain. "What do you mean you didn't know who you were?" "I found out yesterday that I was adopted," Maya explained, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I found out that the woman who raised me had been keeping secrets about my biological family for 28 years. I found out that my mother died young and afraid, and that my grandfather has been wandering around with dementia while his own family mourned him as dead." She picked up one of the larger fragments of the destroyed envelope, a piece that showed part of the legal firm's address. "I found out that I have relatives who want to meet me, and an uncle who would rather destroy mail than let that happen." Nolan sank back into his chair as if the fight had gone out of him completely. For a moment he looked less like the cold, authoritative manager who had fired her, and more like what he actually was. A middle-aged man carrying decades of family pain and resentment, struggling to understand how his carefully controlled world had suddenly become so complicated. "She died?" he asked, and his voice was smaller now, almost vulnerable. "Rhiannon died?" "In a car accident in Australia, according to the letter my adoptive mother left me," Maya confirmed. "Years ago, she never got to see me grow up. She never got to know what kind of person I became." She set the paper fragment down carefully, as if it were something precious rather than evidence of sabotage and cruelty. "And now our grandfather is missing, confused and alone somewhere in Wellington, because the people who should have been taking care of him were too busy being angry about the past to actually help him in the present." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of all the family dysfunction and missed opportunities that had led them to this moment. Two relatives facing each other across a desk littered with destroyed correspondence, both of them damaged by secrets and lies and the kind of pain that gets passed down through generations like a family heirloom no one wants to inherit. "I didn't know," Nolan said finally, and there was something broken in his voice that made Maya realize that his cruelty had been born from pain rather than malice. "I didn't know she was dead. I didn't know you didn't know. I thought you were just another person trying to take advantage of an old man's confusion. And I thought you were just a heartless manager who fired people for being kind," Maya replied. It seems we were both wrong about each other. Through the office window, she could see the normal rhythm of the restaurant continuing. Customers ordering meals, staff working efficiently, the mundane business of life carrying on, despite the family drama unfolding in the back room. It struck her that this was how most family secrets were revealed. Not in dramatic confrontations or emotional crescendos, but in small, cluttered offices while the rest of the world remained oblivious to the seismic shifts happening just out of sight. "What happens now?" Nolan asked, and for the first time since she'd known him he sounded genuinely uncertain, as if the script he'd been following for years had suddenly become irrelevant. Maya looked at the fragments of her destroyed mail, at her uncle's guilty face, at the motivational posters promising that teamwork made dreams come true. What happened now was that she had to decide whether family meant anything when it came wrapped in such complicated packaging. What happened now was that she had to figure out whether forgiveness was possible when the person who had wronged her was also one of the few blood relatives she had left in the world. "Now we find our grandfather," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "Before it's too late." The search for Leif Vidal had consumed 3 agonizing days. Maya found herself caught between grief for Annika and desperate urgency for a grandfather she'd only just discovered existed. Wellington's streets had never seemed so vast or cruel as they did now. Each alleyway and doorway a potential hiding place for a confused old man who might not even remember his own name. The police had been sympathetic, but realistic. Elderly people with dementia went missing all the time, and with limited resources they could only do so much for someone who had been voluntarily absent from care for years. It was Roberto who finally got the call that changed everything. Maya was sitting in his office in Thorndon, surrounded by missing person flyers they'd printed at her suggestion, when his mobile rang with news from Hutt Hospital. A man matching Leif's description had been brought in by ambulance after collapsing outside the central library. The caller, a social worker named Patricia Wong, explained that he'd been found with severe dehydration and signs of exposure, clutching a soggy McDonald's napkin in his fist like a lifeline. The drive to Lower Hutt felt interminable. Every red light and traffic delay another moment stolen from whatever time they might have left with the man who connected all the broken pieces of their family puzzle. Roberto drove with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun years of regret, while Maya stared out the passenger window at a city that looked different now that she understood her place in it. Every elderly person on the street made her heart skip. Was that him? Could that be her grandfather? The man whose blood ran through her veins? Whose daughter had been her mother? Whose absence had shaped decades of family pain? Hutt Hospital's geriatric ward smelled of disinfectant and industrial floor polish, underlaid with the subtler sense of human frailty and institutional care. The corridors were painted in those optimistic pastel shades that health authorities seemed to believe would somehow make illness and aging more palatable. But the overall effect was more depressing than comforting. Maya had spent enough time in hospitals during Aneka's illness to recognize the particular quality of hope and despair that hung in the air like invisible fog. Dr. Emaruatapu met them at the nurses' station with the kind of professional demeanor that balanced medical authority with human compassion. She was younger than Maya had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the slightly exhausted look of someone who worked long shifts dealing with Wellington's most vulnerable populations. Her explanation of Leif's condition was delivered with clinical precision, but there was genuine concern in her voice as she described the extent of his physical and mental deterioration. "He's been living rough for some time," she explained as they walked towards his room. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of advanced dementia. The exposure hasn't helped. We've had some particularly cold nights recently, and sleeping outdoors in Wellington winter is dangerous for anyone, let alone someone in his condition." She paused outside a door marked with a number that seemed unremarkable for containing so much family significance. "I should warn you. His lucidity comes and goes. Sometimes he's quite present and conversational. Other times he seems lost in memories from decades ago. And occasionally he doesn't recognize where or when he is at all." Through the small window in the door, Maya caught her first glimpse of her grandfather since that day in McDonald's. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital bed and the thin institutional blankets. His hair, which had been unkempt but still recognizably styled when she'd seen him in the restaurant, now hung limp and lifeless around his shoulders. His face had the sunken quality that came from weight loss and dehydration, making his cheekbones sharp and his eyes appear larger and more vulnerable. But it was definitely him, those pale blue eyes that had looked at her with such gratitude when she'd bought him lunch, the hands that had trembled while counting coins, the gentle expression that had made her want to help despite the professional risks. This was Leif Vidal, her grandfather, Roberto's father, the man whose search for his lost daughter had inadvertently led to Maya's discovery of her own identity. "Sometimes he asks about people from his past," Dr. Rutapu continued quietly. "Names we don't recognize. Leora, Ina, sometimes someone called Catherine. Yesterday he kept asking for someone named Rhiannon, wanting to know if she'd had the baby yet." The irony was heartbreaking. Leif was asking about his daughter, not knowing that the baby he wondered about was now a 28-year-old woman standing just outside his hospital room. He just wanted to care for his sick wife. Night after night he sat beside her bed in silence, watching her fade away with dementia, until he began to suspect something wasn't right. So he decided to install a hidden camera in her room. But what he saw there completely changed everything he thought he knew about his wife, about their past, and even about himself. From that moment on, old secrets began to surface. Voices in the early hours, unexpected visitors, a forbidden name, and the reappearance of someone he believed had never existed. Prepare yourself for a story that's realistic, devastating, and impossible to predict. By the end, you'll be asking yourself, what if this happened in my family? But before we continue, you need to see what that camera revealed. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss stories like this one, and tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from? When Rakura Menzies woke for the 5th time that morning, his wife's breathing sounded different. It wasn't the fragile wheeze of someone in advanced stages of dementia as the medical report indicated. It was rhythmic, alive, as if waiting for something. Rakura sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes red from nights of poor sleep, watching the rain streak down the windows of their modest weatherboard home in Lower Hutt. The Wellington Harbor winds rattled the old window frames like skeletal fingers against glass, but inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the oxygen concentrator they'd hired from the medical supply company in Petone. He hesitated before touching the remote control of the small hidden camera he had discreetly installed behind one of the Maori sculptures in his wife's room. The carved jade tiki had belonged to Kahurangi's grandmother, passed down through generations of strong Maori women who had survived colonization, land wars, and the slow erosion of their culture. Te Waia, Kahurangi used to call it. The mother. Now it served as camouflage for his desperate attempt to understand what was happening to the woman he'd loved for 37 years. The woman who'd stood beside him through redundancy, depression, and the devastating loss of their first child. Since the diagnosis, he felt something didn't make sense. The doctors at Wellington Hospital had been thorough, their reports detailed and filled with medical terminology that made his head spin. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the neurologist with kind eyes and gentle hands, had shown him brain scans that looked like gray storms on black seas. Significant hippocampal damage, she'd explained, pointing to shadows that apparently represented the destruction of his wife's memories. The oxygen deprivation during the fire caused extensive neurological impairment. I'm sorry, Mr. Menzies, but the woman you knew, she's not coming back. But something in his gut twisted every time they spoke about irreversible brain damage. Kahurangi had moments, fleeting seconds when her eyes seemed to focus with laser intensity, when she'd reach for his hand with purpose, rather than the random grasping the physiotherapist said was normal. Moments when she'd hum old Maori Waiata under her breath, songs she claimed not to remember when the occupational therapist tested her recall, and what he saw that early morning made his blood freeze. The image was grainy, but clear enough to see every detail of the room he knew so well. There was the woman he loved, Kahurangi Menzies, lying in the hospital bed they'd hired when the stairs became too difficult for her weakened legs. Her silver-streaked hair spread across the pillow like spilled moonlight, the same hair he used to braid when they were young and she'd fall asleep reading novels by Patricia Grace and Witi Ihimaera. The room smelled of antiseptic cream and the lavender essential oils he'd been dabbing on her wrists, hoping to trigger some memory, some spark of recognition that would bring her back to him. The walls were covered with photographs from their life together. Their wedding day at the Otaki Maori church, holidays in Rotorua where they'd honeymooned, pictures of the baby they'd lost and the children who never came after. He'd put them there on the advice of the memory care specialist, creating a visual timeline that might penetrate whatever fog had settled over his wife's mind. But then, with an almost ceremonial slowness that made his stomach clench with dread, she opened her eyes. Not the vacant, unfocused gaze he'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 years, but sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness with the clarity of someone fully present. She lifted her torso slightly, her movements deliberate and controlled, nothing like the fumbling confusion that had characterized her waking hours for months, and murmured in a firm voice, almost irritated, "He can't know. Not yet." Raukura's heart stopped. The voice that emerged from his wife's lips had no trace of confusion or cognitive limitation. It was the voice of the woman who used to debate politics with him over morning coffee, who could recite entire passages from Maori legends, who had once been the sharpest administrative assistant at the Hutt City Council before budget cuts forced her into early retirement. It was the voice of the woman who'd held him when his father died, who'd whispered comfort during his darkest moments after losing their baby. He turned up the volume on his laptop, his hands trembling so violently he nearly knocked over the cold cup of tea beside him, tea that had been sitting there since midnight when he'd given up trying to sleep and retreated to his makeshift surveillance station in the spare room. Kahurangi was looking directly at someone outside the camera's field of view. Her expression one he recognized from their early marriage, the look she wore when making difficult decisions, when protecting something precious, when standing up to his mother who'd never thought a Maori girl was good enough for her son. "You promised to protect me, and protect her too." The words hit him like a physical blow. Who was her, and whom was she talking to? The house was locked, every window secured with the safety catches he'd installed after the fire, every door fitted with deadbolts that he checked obsessively each night before bed. No one should have access to that room without him knowing. They lived at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Naine where Mrs. Patterson from next door spent her days watching through lace curtains, where nothing happened without the entire street knowing about it within hours. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where people still looked out for each other, where Mr. Singh brought them vegetables from his garden, where young Emma from 3 doors down offered to help with shopping, where everyone had rallied around them after the fire with casseroles and offers of assistance that had sustained them through the worst months. As the video continued, a shadow passed across the wall, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful precision of someone trying not to make noise on the old wooden floorboards that creaked with every step. Rakura paused the recording, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that misted in the cold air of the unheated spare room. That silhouette, It was unmistakable. The way the figure held his shoulders, slightly forward from years of carrying heavy equipment. The distinctive gait he'd observed countless times across their back fence. A measured walk that spoke of someone accustomed to emergency situations, to moving quickly but deliberately through dangerous spaces. The neighbor, Wiremu Fahe. Firefighter, single, always helpful, and strangely always present since the fire in the guest room 2 years before. Wiremu had been the first responder that terrible night, the one who'd carried Kahurangi's unconscious body from the smoke-filled room while Rakura stood frozen in the doorway, paralyzed by the sight of flames consuming the space where his wife had been taking what she'd said would be a quick, relaxing bath. Since then, Wiremu had been checking on them regularly, bringing groceries when Rakura seemed overwhelmed by the complexities of caregiving, offering to sit with Kahurangi when the isolation became too much. He'd installed the wheelchair ramp without being asked, had fixed the leaking tap in the kitchen, had somehow known exactly what they needed before they'd had to ask for help. Rakura had been grateful for the support, had seen it as neighborly kindness in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. But now, watching this large man move through his house in the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every piece of furniture stood, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with Wellington's winter winds. But what the devil was he doing there inside, in the middle of the night with his supposedly ill wife? Before he could think about calling the police, before he could process the full magnitude of what he was witnessing, Rakura pressed play again. What he heard next made him drop the remote control on the floor, the plastic casing cracking against the wooden boards with a sound that seemed to echo through the sleeping house. Kahurangi's voice crystal clear saying, "She's still out there, but I can't see her." Not until he knows the whole truth. Rakura's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Who was this she his wife spoke of with such tenderness? The way she said it with a mother's protective fierceness made his chest tighten with a grief he couldn't name. It was the same tone she'd used when talking about the baby they'd lost all those years ago. The same careful, reverent way she'd whispered about the daughter they'd planned to name Hayata, Morning Light, before the miscarriage at 12 weeks had shattered their dreams of parenthood. And why did Wiremu seem so involved? In the dim light of the recording, he could see the firefighter's face clearly for the first time. There were tears in his eyes, and when he reached out to touch Kahurangi's hand, it was with the gentleness of someone who'd done it many times before, someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how to offer comfort without causing alarm. The weight of betrayal crushed Rakura's chest like a concrete slab. For 2 years he had been caring for a woman he thought had lost her mind, feeding her porridge with a spoon, speaking to her in the simplified sentences the occupational therapist had recommended for communicating with dementia patients, changing her nappies with the patient dignity the home care nurse had taught him, treating her body with the respect due to someone who could no longer maintain their own hygiene, speaking to her as if she were a child, sharing his daily thoughts because the doctors said familiar voices might penetrate the fog of dementia, might create moments of connection, even when recognition seemed impossible. He'd told her about the neighbor's new fence, about the price of petrol, about his worries for their financial future, now that her disability pension was their only steady income. And all this time, she had been perfectly lucid, plotting something he couldn't yet understand. But the most devastating part wasn't the deception itself. It was realizing that the woman he had loved for decades, the mother of the child they'd lost, the partner who'd stood beside him through his father's death, and his own struggles with depression after being made redundant from the railway. This woman was a complete stranger, and apparently, she had been for much longer than he could imagine. 2 years earlier, a small candle lit in the bathroom had caused the fire that nearly took Kahurangi's life. At least, that was the story everyone told. The official narrative, repeated by doctors, firefighters, and Kahurangi herself in the confused, fragmented weeks following the incident, was that she'd been having a relaxing bath on that bitter Wellington winter evening in July, had lit a vanilla candle for ambiance, and somehow knocked it over when reaching for her towel. Rakura remembered that night with the crystalline clarity that trauma brings to memory. He'd been in the lounge watching the news, something about government budget cuts affecting public services, when he'd smelled smoke. Not the comfortable wood smoke from their neighbor's chimney, but the acrid chemical smell of synthetic materials burning. By the time he'd reached the bathroom door, it was too hot to touch, and he could hear Kahurangi calling his name through the thickening smoke. The flames had spread quickly through the old wooden bathroom, racing up the walls like hungry fingers, trapping her inside as smoke filled her lungs with toxins that would later, the doctors explained, deprive her brain of oxygen for crucial minutes. Wiremu Fahey had arrived before the fire trucks, appearing at their door in his volunteer firefighter gear as if summoned by some sixth sense. He'd kicked in the bathroom door when Raukura's attempts had failed, disappearing into the smoke-filled space with the kind of courage that made ordinary people seem heroic. The aftermath had been devastating. Oxygen deprivation, the emergency doctor at Wellington Hospital had explained in that careful, practiced tone they used for delivering life-altering news. Dr. James Morrison, a man whose gray beard and weary eyes spoke of too many difficult conversations, had sat them down in a sterile consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. "The brain is remarkably resilient," he'd said, spreading scan results across the table like tarot cards predicting a grim future. "But oxygen is life. When deprived for more than a few minutes, neurons begin to die. The damage your wife sustained, I'm afraid it's significant. Brain damage. Cognitive impairment." The woman who'd once managed complex filing systems at the council office, who remembered everyone's birthday and anniversary, who could recite genealogies going back 7 generations, was reduced to someone who couldn't recognize her own reflection in the mirror. Since then, she alternated between vacant stares and disconnected phrases. "The birds are singing backwards," she'd say during afternoon tea, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone she'd once used to discuss council budgets. Or, "Someone moved the blue cup," accompanied by frantic searching through cupboards for items that hadn't moved in years. Raukura had learned to nod and smile, to treat these utterances as the random firing of damaged neurons, the verbal equivalent of phantom limb pain. The occupational therapist, a kind woman named Helen Morrison, who drove out from Wellington twice a week, had taught him to create routines, to speak simply, to find comfort in small moments of connection, even when recognition seemed impossible. "Think of it like tending a garden after a harsh frost," she'd said, her weathered hands demonstrating how to guide Kahurangi through basic exercises. The roots might still be alive even when everything above ground appears dead. Helen had introduced them to support groups, to online forums for caregivers, to the strange new vocabulary of cognitive decline, sundowning, wandering, catastrophic reactions, words that became part of Raukura's daily reality as he learned to navigate this foreign landscape of lost memories and confused perceptions. But now, faced with the recent footage, everything seemed like a cruel performance. Raukura didn't know if he felt anger or relief. Relief perhaps to see her lucid again, to know that somewhere inside that seemingly broken shell, his wife still existed, still thought and felt and remembered their life together. Anger, certainly, for her hiding something so serious, for letting him believe he was losing her when she'd been there all along watching him grieve for a ghost. The relief was intoxicating. For months he'd mourned the loss of his best friend, his confidant, the woman who'd understood his silences and shared his dreams. He'd grieved for conversations that would never happen again, for the shared glances that used to pass between them when their neighbors said something particularly ridiculous at community meetings. The thought that she might still be there, still capable of the connection he'd thought was lost forever, made him want to rush into her room and demand explanations. But the anger burned deeper. How could she watch him struggle with insurance companies who questioned every expense? How could she listen to him talking to her like a child, explaining simple concepts as if she'd never learned them? How could she let him change her nappies, feed her pureed food, make decisions about her care without any input from the person most affected? He spent the following days pretending normality, though every interaction felt like walking through quicksand. Beside the bed, changing her nappies with the mechanical efficiency he'd developed over months of practice, trying not to think about how humiliating this must be for a woman who'd always prized her independence, feeding her thin porridge mixed with the protein powder the dietitian had recommended, watching her accept each spoonful with the blank compliance he'd grown to expect, but now understood might be elaborate acting, chatting about the weather, about Mrs. Patterson's new cat that kept getting into their garden, about the roadworks on High Street that were making shopping trips more complicated, pretending to believe she didn't know who he was, while she pretended not to recognize the man she'd married in 1987 at the small wooden church in Otaki, where her grandmother had been baptized. But at night, he rewatched the recordings, repeatedly, and every single night without fail, Wiremu appeared, sometimes for 5 minutes, slipping in through the back door with a key Rakura had never seen before, moving through their house with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every creaking floorboard. Other times, for half an hour, sitting in the chair beside Kahurangi's bed where Raukura himself spent his days reading aloud from the Dominion Post, or playing old Maori music that used to make her smile. The most disturbing thing was the intimate tone between the two. They talked about the past, about secrets buried so deep that even hearing fragments made Raukura's stomach churn with dread. Wiremu knew things about Kahurangi's childhood that she'd never shared with her husband, stories about her time in the girls' home in Taranaki, about relatives whose names Raukura had never heard, about events that had shaped her in ways he was only now beginning to understand. In the fourth video, recorded on a Thursday night when Wellington's southerly winds were howling through the hills with the ferocity that made windows rattle and power lines sing, Kahurangi whispered, "She's still out there, but I can't see her. Not until he knows the whole truth." Her voice carried a weight of maternal grief that Raukura recognized from their own loss years ago, when they'd miscarried at 12 weeks and Kahurangi had spent months moving through their house like a ghost, touching baby clothes they'd bought too early, standing in doorways of rooms they'd planned to convert into nurseries. Who was she? The daughter they lost at Rotorua Hospital decades ago, when they'd driven 3 hours for a specialist appointment, only to receive the devastating news that the heartbeat had stopped. A forgotten patient from Kahurangi's time volunteering at the Women's Refuge in Porirua, where she'd spent Friday evenings teaching basic literacy to women escaping violence. A granddaughter he didn't know existed, born to some secret child whose existence had been hidden from him for reasons he couldn't fathom. The doctors never mentioned anything about this during the countless appointments, the assessments, the care planning meetings where social workers and nurses discussed Kahurangi's needs as if she weren't in the room. No one had ever suggested that her condition might be connected to anything other than the fire, that there might be psychological factors complicating her recovery. And why did Wiremu seem so emotional when listening? In one of the recordings, when Kahurangi spoke about being afraid, about promises that couldn't be broken without destroying lives, Wiremu had reached out and held her hand with the tenderness of someone who understood her pain intimately. A tear had rolled down the firefighter's weathered face, a face that bore the scars of 20 years responding to emergencies, pulling people from burning buildings and crashed cars, and he'd whispered something Raukura couldn't quite catch, something that made Kahurangi close her eyes as if absorbing comfort from words she'd been waiting desperately to hear. Raukura no longer knew who was sicker, his wife playing an elaborate charade of mental illness with Academy Award-worthy commitment, the neighbor, apparently complicit in whatever deception was unfolding in his own house, or himself, drowning in a lifetime of secrets that now exploded before his eyes like sparks from a rekindled fire. The most chilling moment came on the third night of surveillance. Kahurangi, believing herself alone in the small hours when even the Wellington traffic had died to a whisper, and the city slept under its blanket of harbor fog, began to speak to the ceiling. Her voice was different, not the confused mumbling of a dementia patient, but the clear, purposeful tone of someone making a confession to whatever gods might be listening from the darkness above. "I should have told him from the beginning," she said to the empty air above her bed, her words carrying the weight of decades of regret. "But I was so afraid he'd leave. And then she appeared, and I just couldn't." She began to cry, real tears, not the vacant weeping he'd witnessed during the day when she seemed to mourn things she couldn't name. These were the tears of a woman carrying unbearable weight, of someone who'd made impossible choices and lived with their consequences through sleepless nights and guilty mornings. "He's such a good man," she continued, her voice breaking with the kind of pain that comes from loving someone while believing you don't deserve their love. "He deserves better than lies, but the truth would destroy everything we've built." Raukura felt his world crumbling around him like poorly mixed concrete, each revelation weakening the foundation of everything he'd thought he knew about his life, his marriage, his wife. Every gentle moment of the past 2 years, every time he'd whispered, "I love you," to what he thought was an empty shell she had heard. She had understood, and she had chosen to remain silent, to let him believe he was caring for someone who could no longer love him back, who existed in some twilight world between life and death where connection was impossible. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, while Wellington's notorious southerly winds howled through the valleys and rattled the weatherboard houses of Lower Hutt, like a banshee's wail. Kahurangi spoke a name that made Raukura nearly fall from his chair. The sound cut through the white noise of rain against windows and the distant hum of late-night traffic on the motorway, striking him with the force of a physical blow. Marama. Her voice trembled with an emotion he couldn't identify. Part grief, part longing, part terror. She shouldn't have been born, but she was. Raukura paused the video and rewound it, his fingers fumbling with the laptop controls as if they'd forgotten how to function. The blue progress bar crawled backward through digital time, carrying him back to that moment of revelation. He pressed play again, leaning so close to the screen that his breath fogged the surface. There it was again. Marama. The name emerged from his wife's lips like a prayer and a curse combined, spoken with the reverence reserved for the sacred and the forbidden. He knew that name. It had lived in the deepest chambers of his heart for 38 years, locked away with other precious, painful memories. Marama, Moonbeam in Tereo Maori, was the name they'd chosen together during those golden months when Kahurangi's belly had swelled with promise and their modest weatherboard house had seemed to glow with anticipated joy. They'd spent hours discussing it, lying in bed with his hand on her growing bump, feeling the flutter of tiny limbs and imagining the child who would carry both their bloodlines forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. That was before the bleeding started, before the frantic midnight drive to Wellington Hospital through empty streets slick with winter rain, before the ultrasound revealed what Dr. Sarah Chen had gently called fetal demise, clinical words that couldn't capture the enormity of their loss. The way their dreams had simply stopped, or so he'd thought. With hands that trembled like autumn leaves in a gale, he made his way to the spare room wardrobe where they kept their most precious possessions. The old kauri wood box had belonged to his grandmother, carved with traditional Maori patterns that told stories of Wakapapa, genealogy stretching back through generations of his people. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper that smelled of lavender and thyme, were the remnants of their brief parenthood. Hospital bracelets from Kahurangi's admission, ultrasound images that showed the grainy outline of a baby who would never draw breath, the tiny yellow jumpsuit they'd bought at 3 months, too hopeful and too early, but unable to resist the pull of imagined tomorrows. And there, at the bottom of the box, like archaeological evidence of a civilization that had existed for only 12 weeks, was a handwritten note in Kahurangi's careful script, Baby Marama, due March 15th, 1999. But as Raukura examined the ultrasound more carefully, something cold settled in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The medical details seemed wrong. The date matched his memory, December 1998, when they'd driven to what they thought would be a routine 20-week scan. But the hospital stamp wasn't from Wellington Regional as he remembered. It was from Masterton Public Hospital, 40 minutes north through the Rimutaka Ranges. Why would they have gone to Masterton? They'd never had any connection to that town. No reason to drive the winding mountain road when Wellington Hospital was 15 minutes from their home. And there was something else, a second ultrasound hidden beneath the first, dated 2 months later, February 1999. But that was impossible. By February, their baby was gone. Their hopes buried with the tiny casket in Taita Cemetery, where they'd placed a headstone that read simply, Baby Menzies, too beautiful for Earth. In shock, he began connecting dots that painted a picture he couldn't accept. Kahurangi hadn't lost the baby. She'd given birth. She'd carried their child to term, somewhere in the rolling farmland around Masterton, and then, what? Hidden the birth? Given the baby away? Let him believe their child was dead while she was alive somewhere, breathing and growing and becoming a person he'd never know. The room spun around him like a child's top, and he gripped the edge of the wardrobe to steady himself. 38 years of marriage, and he'd been living with a stranger, a woman capable of deception so profound that it rewrote the fundamental narrative of their shared life. Every March 15th, when he'd placed flowers on that empty grave, she'd known their daughter was somewhere in the world, celebrating birthdays he'd never witness. In the next recording, filmed just 2 nights later, Wiramu's voice carried across the room with startling clarity. He doesn't know, does he? The firefighter's tone held no judgment, only a weary sadness that spoke of burdens shared across decades. Kahurangi's response cut through Raukura like a blade heated in flame. No, and he must never know. She's better off away from him. The casual cruelty of those words, the assumption that his own daughter would be better off without him, hit harder than any physical blow he'd ever endured. What kind of father did she think he was? What kind of man had she married that she'd go to such lengths to keep his child from him? But before he could sink further into the quicksand of self-doubt and rage, the present crashed into his consciousness with the jarring sound of their front doorbell. The old brass chime echoed through the house with its familiar two-note song, the same sound that had welcomed friends and family for over 2 decades. Raukura glanced at the digital clock on his laptop. 2:47 a.m. No one visited at this hour unless something was desperately wrong. He made his way through the darkened house, past photographs that now seemed like evidence of an elaborate fiction, past furniture they'd chosen together but which she'd apparently filled with secrets he'd never suspected. The hallway stretched before him like a tunnel leading to an unknown destination, each step echoing on the wooden floors they'd refinished themselves when they'd first bought the house, and believed they understood what their future would hold. Through the frosted glass of the front door, he could see a figure hunched against the weather. Small, slight, drenched by the relentless Wellington rain that turned the street lights into watercolor smears. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat like a fishhook finding flesh. Standing on his doorstep, soaked to the skin and shivering in the kind of thin jacket that offered no protection against New Zealand's winter fury, was a young woman who might have been Kahurangi's twin at 26. The same deep brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets, the same stubborn chin that tilted upward when facing adversity, the same graceful hands that now cradled a bundle wrapped in what looked like a donated blanket from some charitable organization. But it was when she spoke that Raukura's world tilted completely off its axis. Her voice carried the same cadence as Kahurangi's, the same slight emphasis on certain syllables that marked her as someone who'd learned English alongside Te Reo Maori, someone whose tongue was comfortable with the rolling sounds of his ancestors' language. "I've come because of Kahurangi," she said, her words barely audible above the wind that whipped through the pohutukawa trees lining their street. "She called for me. In my dreams, she's been calling for me for weeks now." The young woman shifted the bundle in her arms, and Raukura caught a glimpse of a tiny face, peaceful in sleep despite the chaos of the storm around them. "She told me it was time for you to know about us." The girl, because despite her years, something about her seemed heartbreakingly young, looked up at him with eyes that reflected decades of pain, abandonment, and a desperate hope that maybe, finally, she'd found her way home. Raukura's voice deserted him completely. He could only stare at this apparition from a past he'd never known existed, this living proof that his wife's deception ran deeper than anything he'd imagined. The young woman seemed to take his silence as permission to continue. "My name is Marama Tare," she said, and the sound of that name, their chosen name, spoken by lips that bore an uncanny resemblance to Kahurangi's, nearly brought him to his knees. I think I'm your daughter. And this." She shifted the bundle again, revealing the face of an infant who couldn't be more than a few weeks old. "This is your grandson. His name is Hayata, Morning Light, just like Mom always said she'd name her first boy." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that would consume everything he'd thought he knew about his life. Marama, Hayata, names they'd chosen together, names that were supposed to belong to children who'd died before drawing breath, now attached to living, breathing people standing on his doorstep in the middle of a Wellington winter night. As if summoned by the sound of their names spoken aloud, Kahurangi's voice drifted from the back of the house, not the confused mumbling of a dementia patient, but the clear, urgent call of a mother who sensed her child was near. "Marama, Taku Kotiro, is that you? My daughter. Is that you?" The young woman's face crumpled with an emotion too complex to name. Relief, grief, love, and fear warred across features that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion that painted dark circles under her eyes and hollowed her cheeks with the gauntness of someone who'd been surviving rather than living. "She knows I'm here," Marama whispered, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. Even sick, even lost in her mind, she knows her baby has come home. The name belonged to someone who shouldn't exist, yet here she stood. Marama Tare carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned early that the world was not a safe place, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her clothes told a story of temporary shelters and charity donations. A faded Salvation Army jacket that hung loose on her slight frame, jeans that had been mended multiple times with mismatched thread, boots that had walked countless kilometers on uncertain ground. She had no documents, she explained as Raukura led her into the warmth of their lounge. Just a plastic hospital bracelet, that had somehow survived 26 years of displacement. The writing was faded, but Raukura could still make out baby girl Menzies and a date in March 1999, exactly when their daughter should have been born, if she'd lived, if she'd ever existed in the first place, which now seemed like the cruelest of lies. "I've been living in caravans and hostels since I was 14, Marama said, settling into the same armchair where Kahurangi used to read her evening paper, where she'd planned meals and worried about their finances, and never once mentioned having a living daughter somewhere in the world. Moving between Wanganui and Napier, following seasonal work in the orchards and vineyards, sometimes staying in emergency housing when the weather got too rough or the baby was coming. She spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone for whom uncertainty was normal, for whom home was wherever she could find shelter for the night. But when she mentioned her childhood, her voice carried an edge of something darker, abandonment that went deeper than simple poverty, a betrayal that had shaped every relationship since. "When I was 14, a blonde woman came to the foster family I was staying with in Palmerston North. She had an envelope of cash and some papers to sign. After that, no one was allowed to ask questions about where I'd come from or who my real parents were. It was like I'd been erased from the system completely." Marama's fingers traced the edges of the hospital bracelet with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "But I kept this, even when everything else was taken away. My clothes, my toys, even the photos I had of the woman who used to visit me in secret. I kept this bracelet. It was the only proof I had that I belonged to someone. Somewhere." Raukura felt the foundations of his understanding crumble like coastal cliffs in a storm. A woman who visited in secret, blonde hair, which could describe dozens of people, but somehow felt significant in ways he couldn't grasp. Money changing hands to ensure silence. His daughter, because looking at her now, seeing Kahurangi's stubborn chin and his own dark eyes reflected back at him, there was no doubt about her parentage, had been bought and sold like property, hidden away by people who'd convinced him she was dead. Her arrival turned the house upside down in ways that went beyond the practical chaos of unexpected guests. Suddenly, their modest 3-bedroom home felt enormous and claustrophobic simultaneously. Rooms that had been shrines to a childless marriage, the spare bedroom where they'd started to paint nursery colors before stopping, the study where Kahurangi kept her books and he stored his railway memorabilia, now seemed to echo with the ghosts of lives that should have been lived within these walls. Raukura tried to maintain his composure, but something fundamental broke inside him when Marama wandered into the kitchen and paused before the refrigerator, where their old family photos were held by fading magnets. Her finger hovered over their wedding picture, him in his best suit borrowed from his brother Kahurangi, radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, both of them young and convinced they could handle whatever the future held. "You're the man from the photo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father. She used to show me this picture when she visited, before they made her stop coming. She'd tell me stories about how you met at a church social in Otaki, how you taught her to drive in your old Ford Cortina, how you cried when you thought she was dying in the fire." The casual intimacy of these details, moments from their courtship that he'd shared with no one except Kahurangi, hit him like physical blows. All these years, while he'd been grieving a lost child, his wife had been sharing their most precious memories with a daughter he'd been told was dead. She'd painted him as a character in stories told to comfort a lonely child, while keeping that same child's existence secret from him. From the back bedroom came a sound that made them both freeze. Kahurangi was crying, not the confused, purposeless weeping that had become commonplace since the fire, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. For the first time in 2 years, her tears seemed connected to something real, something that mattered more than the random synaptic misfires the doctors claimed controlled her emotional responses. "Marama," Kahurangi called, her voice carrying none of the hesitation or confusion that usually marked her speech. "Taku Kotiro, come here. Please. My daughter, come here." The words were spoken in Te Reo Maori, the language of their people, the language Kahurangi had always planned to teach their children alongside English so they'd never forget where they came from. Marama moved toward the sound like iron filings drawn to a magnet, her steps gaining purpose as she approached the room where the woman who'd given birth to her waited. Raukura followed, feeling like an intruder in his own home, watching a reunion he'd never known was needed. When Marama appeared in the doorway, Kahurangi struggled to sit up in bed, her movement suddenly coordinated and purposeful, rather than the careful positioning required by her supposed cognitive limitations. Mother and daughter stared at each other across 26 years of separation, across decades of secrets and lies, and forced silence. "You're so beautiful," Kahurangi whispered, reaching out with hands that no longer trembled with neurological damage but with the overwhelming emotion of touching her child for the first time since infancy. "You look just like my mother did at your age. She would have been so proud to know you." Marama collapsed into her mother's arms like a building finally giving way to the foundation damage that had weakened it for years. The baby in her arms, Hayata, Raukura's grandson whose existence was another impossibility in a day full of them, stirred at the movement but didn't wake, as if sensing that this moment required the peace that only deep sleep could provide. "I'm sorry," Kahurangi said, the words emerging between sobs that shook her entire body. "I'm so sorry, my darling girl. I tried to keep you safe, but I made everything worse. I thought if he knew about you, if he knew what I'd done, what you'd done." Raukura's voice cut through the emotional reunion like a knife through silk. The question had been building pressure inside him since Marama's arrival, since the discovery of hospital records that didn't match his memories, since the realization that his entire understanding of their marriage had been built on quicksand. Both women turned to look at him, and for a moment he saw himself reflected in their eyes. A stranger in his own home, a husband and father who'd been excluded from the most important relationships in his life. Through deception so elaborate, it had required the cooperation of multiple people across decades. "What did you do, Kahurangi? That was so terrible you had to fake your own brain damage to avoid telling me about it." But before she could answer, before any of them could process the magnitude of what was happening, Marama swayed on her feet like a sapling in a gale. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen and waxy. She clutched the baby tighter as her knees buckled, and Raukura lunged forward just in time to catch them both before they hit the floor. "Something's wrong," he said, as blood began to seep through Marama's jeans, dark stains spreading across the denim like spilled ink. "We need to call an ambulance." Kahurangi's response was immediate and devastating in its clarity. Gone was any pretense of cognitive impairment as she began issuing instructions with the authority of someone fully present and terrifyingly aware. "She's hemorrhaging. Postpartum complications. Probably from lack of proper medical care. Call 111 now. Tell them we have a young mother with heavy bleeding and a newborn who needs evaluation." As Raukura fumbled for his phone, his mind reeling between relief that his wife was clearly functional and terror that his newly discovered daughter might be dying in his arms, Kahurangi continued speaking with medical precision that revealed yet another layer of deception. "I'm trained in midwifery, Raukura. I studied it before we married, before the railway job became available for you and we moved to Wellington. I've been hiding that too, along with everything else." Her voice broke on the last words, but her instructions remained clear and urgent. "Get towels from the bathroom, clean ones, and tell them we'll need the neonatal team for the baby." The small bedroom became a crisis center, filled with the organized chaos of emergency response. But even as Raukura worked to save his daughter's life, even as sirens wailed in the distance and paramedics raced through Wellington's empty streets toward their home, one thought echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. How many other secrets was his wife keeping? How many other lives had been hidden from him behind the convenient fiction of brain damage and memory loss? And now that the truth was finally emerging, would any of them survive its revelation intact? The hospital in Porirua was shrouded in the peculiar silence that descends on medical facilities during the early morning hours, when the boundary between night and day becomes fluid and time seems suspended in antiseptic-scented limbo. Raukura sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair outside the surgical theater, his clothes still damp from the rain and spotted with his daughter's blood, watching the digital clock above the nurse's station tick through the minutes with mechanical indifference. Marama had been between life and death when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics, a young Maori woman named Aroha, and an older Pakeha man, whose weathered hands spoke of decades spent saving lives, had worked with practiced efficiency in their lounge, transforming the space where he'd watched rugby matches and anniversary dinners into a battlefield where every second counted. The amount of blood had been staggering, soaking through towels and staining the wooden floors that Kahurangi had polished just days before, back when he'd still believed she was incapable of such simple tasks. The baby, his grandson Hayata, though the reality of that relationship still felt as foreign as speaking a language he'd never learned, had been rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit. Born too early, underweight, showing signs of the kind of medical neglect that spoke of a mother with no access to proper prenatal care. The pediatric team had whisked him away in an incubator that looked like a spaceship designed for the smallest astronauts, leaving Raukura to grapple with emotions he had no framework for processing. Kahurangi sat beside him now, fully lucid and eerily calm, as if the medical crisis had stripped away the last pretense of her elaborate deception. She'd ridden in the ambulance, providing medical history with the precision of someone who'd never lost a day of memory to brain damage, answering questions about Marama's pregnancy and birth history that revealed layers of knowledge she shouldn't have possessed if their daughter had truly been absent from their lives. "You need to see this," she said quietly, reaching into the small handbag she'd somehow remembered to grab before the ambulance departed. From its depths, she withdrew a manila envelope, creased and worn as if it had been handled countless times over many years. "The video from last night, the one where she's bleeding, and I'm screaming for help. I need you to see what happened when you thought I was too damaged to understand." Raukura's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope, unsure whether he wanted to examine its contents or throw it away unread. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained not paper but lead or guilt, or the accumulated mass of decades of deception. "This is from the camera you hid," Kahurangi continued, her voice carrying none of the confusion or hesitation that had marked her speech for 2 years. "The one behind Nana's tiki. I've known about it since the second day. I could see the little red light reflecting off the jade when the room was dark." The casual revelation hit him like a slap. She'd known he was watching her, had performed her elaborate charade while fully aware that her every movement was being recorded. The violation felt mutual now. He'd invaded her privacy, but she'd manipulated his emotions with surgical precision. Inside the envelope were printouts of medical records, birth certificates, and photographs that documented a life he'd never known existed. Official papers from Masterton Hospital showing that baby girl Menzies had been born on March 15, 1999, at 3:47 a.m., weighing 6 pounds 2 ounces. A healthy baby girl with all 10 fingers and toes, scored normally on every assessment, given to a mother who'd checked out of the hospital 12 hours later and disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of New Zealand's child welfare system. "You gave birth," he said, though the words felt inadequate to capture the enormity of what the documents revealed. "You carried her to term, delivered her safely, and then, what? Just handed her over to strangers?" Kahurangi's expression crumpled like paper thrown into flames. "It wasn't that simple. Nothing about any of this was simple." She pulled another photograph from the envelope, this one showing a much younger version of herself holding a newborn baby, both of them in a hospital bed that wasn't at Wellington Regional. Her face in the picture showed the exhaustion of new motherhood combined with something darker: terror, desperation, the haunted look of someone who'd made an impossible choice. "I was sent away," she began, her voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise of monitors beeping and ventilation systems humming. "When I started showing, when it became obvious I was pregnant, my family, they couldn't handle the shame. An unmarried Maori girl carrying a baby in 1998. It was different then, Raukura. The judgment, the gossip, the way people would cross the street rather than acknowledge our existence." She paused, gathering strength for revelations that had been locked away for over 2 decades. "They sent me to a home for unwed mothers in Masterton, run by the Anglican Church, supposedly a place where girls could have their babies in secret and then make appropriate arrangements for their futures. What they didn't tell us was that those arrangements had already been made. The babies were going to families who could afford to pay for them, and we were just the vessels delivering the merchandise." The words painted a picture of institutional cruelty that made Raukura's stomach churn. His wife, barely 22 at the time, alone and frightened, had been shipped off like an inconvenience, isolated from everyone who loved her while strangers made decisions about her child's future. "But you kept her," he said, studying the photograph where Kahurangi's arms wrapped protectively around the infant. "At least initially. This picture shows you bonding with her. For 3 days, Kahurangi whispered. "They let me hold her for 3 days while they processed the paperwork. I named her Marama, even though they said it didn't matter since the adoptive family would choose their own name. I fed her, changed her, slept with her on my chest so she'd know she was loved, even if it was only for 72 hours. The image of his young wife, alone in a strange place, cherishing every moment with a baby she knew would be taken from her, brought tears to his eyes. But beneath the sympathy was a growing anger that she'd never told him any of this. that she'd let him believe their child was dead, rather than trust him with the truth. They came for her on the fourth morning, Kahurangi continued. A social worker with kind eyes and a clipboard full of lies about how the adoptive family was perfect, how they could give her opportunities we never could. I fought them. I screamed and begged and threatened to call the police, but I was just a frightened girl with no money and no legal representation. They took her anyway. So how did she end up in the foster system? If she was adopted by this perfect family, why was she living in caravans and moving between hostels? Kahurangi's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor, because the perfect family decided after 6 months that raising a Maori child was more challenging than they'd anticipated. They returned her to the system like a defective appliance, and by then the paperwork had been altered to hide her connection to us. She became just another displaced kid in an overburdened system, and I spent years trying to find her through legal channels that led nowhere.